Alright, so today's talk is going to be about the vision and the voice, and Crowley's visions of the 30 aethers that are kind of the circular or outer ring parts of the Enochian system, as opposed to the watchtower or sort of square parts. There's one thing to emphasize right off the bat that's really, really important, is that Crowley's visions of the aethers happen at, well, the first two happened very early in his magical career in 1902, and then later on, it's years later that he has the other ones. And Crowley, in his account of these in the Vision and the Voice, makes numerous reference to the Book of the Law during the first two chapters, first two aethers, which is highly significant because Crowley hadn't experienced the Book of the Law yet. He hadn't written the Book of the Law yet. So the fact that he felt that it was being directly referenced by these indicates that this was a sort of prefiguring of his Holy Guardian Angel initiation that happened later on in his magical career. And what this implies, essentially, is that, and which Crowley states explicitly, is that he considered this to be, he considered this to be a method of initiation, a method of self-initiation. He was taking himself to magical grades that he said that before he kind of like wrote certain things about. For example, like Liber 7 is supposed to be the birth words of, Babe of the Abyss, which was grade that he didn't feel like he had attained to yet. Things he was talking about in Liber Aurorita, he didn't feel like he had attained to yet. And this was the experience that he felt that brought him to that level of spiritual understanding and brought him to that level of occult power, essentially. It took a while for the grade of the Magus to realize itself. He'll talk later about how that sort of, in his Confessions, he talks about how that happens later on during his trip in America. And he has a lot of life experiences, divides into certain numbers of days and chunks or whatever. But this, what he did here, which produced the Vision of the Voice, that was the thing, the trigger for all this. That was what set all this off. And it happens in a few different stages. And it began in 1902 and finished, I would say probably in the 20s. I don't have the Confessions memorized or anything like that, but I would say that would be where he would call the end of it. So, now, there's reference to John Dee and Edward Kelly directly in The Vision and the Voice. This particularly happens in the 6th Aether, which Crowley says involves the angel Ave, who's a major character in True and Faithful Relation, which is what we were talking about last time. And Ave says specifically, I mean, we talked about a passage before, which I think I've talked about a few times in a different one of these lectures about, where the angel comes to Edward Kelly and says there is no sin, Jesus isn't to be worshipped as God, and the other things, which I have implied have homosexual undertones, which Dee didn't want to write down. And specifically in the 6th Aether, the angel says, John Dee got this wrong, and this was an actual revelation, and this was supposed to be taken seriously by Dee and Kelly, and they fucked it up, basically. And and that's when the angel says explicitly that the doctrines that were given to Dee and Kelly were, what was it called, fruit ripped untimely from the tree by the hand of a desperate magician, which referred to Edward Kelly, apparently. And it's interesting to note that Crowley gives almost no credit to John Dee for anything in any of his writings. He completely dismisses Dee. He hates. He says explicitly that he really doesn't like Dee, and he gives all the credit to Kelly, which is essentially the opposite of every other commentator on the subject who says Edward Kelly is a fraud and a horse thief, and he was probably playing Dee for a chump, and Dee is the guy who gets all the real credit. Which is interesting. Even people who are invested in the occult don't give Kelly very much credit most of the time. Most of the time, he is dismissed. So I think it's very interesting that Crowley Crowley claims to be the reincarnation of Edward Kelly, just as he claims to be the reincarnation of Eliphas Levi, which would mean that this is a sort of a staple character in the whole development of occultism in general and making these ideas available, because those are the books that we have. that's the information we're working with, which is interesting from a purely causal perspective. And in that same vision, what I think we should look at from a historical perspective is the angel says that he calls the master of the magician, the master of Kelly, he identifies as Martin Luther, who sort of was the spawn of Protestantism. And you look at John Dee, which is happening after Henry VIII, which is the spawn of a different kind of Protestantism. So essentially, when the original Dee Kelly communications happens, this happens directly after the breaking of the power of the Catholic Church, the breaking of the spiritual authority of the Catholic Church, and all of a sudden now angels are being able to contact people who are working in countries where they can't go. As I said in the previous lecture, John Dee was brought before the Star Chamber. He was brought up on charges of witchcraft and stuff like that, and he was able to escape that because he was living in a country that was not under Catholic authority anymore. And so in the sixth Aether, the angel is directly identifying this and spelling this out and kind of telling Crowley, like, this is why the new Aeon was able to get information about it at the time that it was happening, far before the new Aeon actually came into place in 1904, at that, like, hundreds of years later, essentially, which is interesting to think about when we think about, if we look at the new Aeon as a concept, when we look at the current of Thelema as a concept, you have to realize, and Crowley says this in other places, that it progresses at different rates in different areas and different points in time, and it's not like a big thrust. If you can see a reflection of it hundreds of years before it actually happens, even if it was because of an incredible magical ritual duo who have really never been mimic saints. I mean, Crowley and Newberg were very impressive. They came up with some great stuff. The Paris working, as well as the Vision and the Voice, are two, staple occult texts. But at the same time, compared to the amount of material that Dee and Kelly produced, it's not. It's very impressive. It's incredible. But at the same time, it's not close to that amount of material. Essentially, what Luther did, aside from the whole concept of the idea that the Catholic Church's authority would be ruptured. And this is where we have to think about authority. I've said before that when you do a magical ritual, what you're calling on is your spiritual authority. That's how you identify yourself. The way that you control any spirit or make anything happen or give yourself the authority, you have to have the authority. That's why we call on names of God. That's why we say certain prayers. That's why we identify ourselves with certain God forms or use certain invocations, or whatever it is that we're doing, draw certain sigils. We are establishing our authority over a causal relationship.